This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel.
Okay, we are sitting with Senior Analyst of the FDD, Dr. David Adesnik, once again. He's come on to offer us an update on the research which he alluded to during our discussion last week, one that has recently been published and should headline every major newspaper from here to New York. But instead, it's met with radio silence by the media. That's little surprise because it's the media who has taken advantage of those numbers to promote and progress the destructive agenda of lies and propaganda created by the established terrorist organization Hamas. David, welcome back. Thanks for taking the time. Tell us, start to finish, how were the numbers counted? Why were they counted that way? And what should have been done?
Sure. Why don't I just start with what happened over the weekend after we last spoke? It was actually on Saturday morning. One of my colleagues passed to me a story from the Jerusalem Post, which I believe is the first place that picked up on it. And it said the United Nations has lowered its estimate of the number of women and children killed in Gaza during this war. It lowered its estimate of children from 14,500 to under 8,000. It lowered its estimate of women from more than 9,500 to under 5,000. So altogether, it lowered its estimate almost 50% from a total of 24,000 individuals, lowered it 11,000 to 13,000. So I'm like, how could this happen? I mean, they have sort of been at least consistent in what they've been saying, even if it's had credibility issues. So what exactly happened? They certainly didn't make an announcement. They were not trying to make a lot of people aware of their change. What the Jerusalem Post actually noticed, and this is sharp-eyed, is the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, or pronounced OCHA. It issues every few days an update on the state of various things in Gaza. And one of those things is this toll of the alleged number of women and children killed. And on May 6th, it gave that high estimate I mentioned. And all of a sudden on May 8th, it gave the low estimate. What is going on? I mean, how do apparently 11,000 confirmed deaths disappear in 2 days? And the answer is this. So while overall we're seeing Hamas influence the perception of this issue, they've actually had two sort of competing and inconsistent Gaza government organizations addressing it. One is the Ministry of Health. Technically, it's part of the single Palestinian Ministry of Health headed in Ramallah, but the Gaza part is under Hamas control. And it does what you expect a Ministry of Health to do, but more politicized. And then there's also something called the Government Media Office, which really, since at least December, has been issuing claims of fatalities that diverge actually even from the ones the ministry offers, which themselves are problematic, but the Government Media Office is wild. So let me just give you an example from back in December. How do we know they were exaggerating? So at a time when there was about 18,000 casualties, according to the Palestinian estimate, they said there's around 8,000 children, 6,000 women, and 4,000 men. But that was at the same time that the ministry, getting data from the hospital, said there was already more than 5,500 men killed. It was a mathematical impossibility. So we knew from that time forward, the GMO was just, to use a baseball metaphor that may not mean too much to Israelis, they were way out in left field. We can maybe figure out a football equivalent for that, so it means more to your listeners. But the bottom line is, both had serious credibility issues, but GMO is way out there. And yet, OCHA was using GMO. It was, of the two Hamas-controlled sources, it took the worst one. Someone I work with a lot, Gabriel Epstein from the Washington Institute, criticized it at the time. He pointed out these errors, and he said they even admit in one of their documents that quote, the methodology is unknown by which GMO comes up with these things. And I would say, even if they didn't read Mr. Epstein's work, anyone doing basic due diligence should have seen the flaws. So fast forward now, for some reason, after May 6th and before May 8th, OCHA, the UN office, decided we can't use the GMO numbers anymore. We're going to switch to the other Hamas source. And so all of a sudden, overnight, it all drops by 11,000, with one last kicker I'll give you before I stop, which is the UN now still says, okay, 11,000 were not dead, but we're still sticking with the overall number. We still say it's right that 35,000 is the total. We're not going down from there. We're just going to say that there's a very, very large number of unidentified individuals. That's the big news over the weekend.
So essentially, they've stopped listening to one pretend amount of numbers in lieu of a different sort of unestablished set of numbers. Like it's sort of fake numbers divided by 2 equals another fake number. Is that?
I think in a short phrase, yes, but let me give you a little bit of nuance so everyone understands sort of in part both how Hamas pulled it off and why the UN is sticking to it. So as I mentioned, right, 2 competing sources. The one that's less radically out of line with reality is the Ministry of Health. It has worked on this issue for many years. I think we spoke about it last time a bit. Its general estimates of the number of dead in some previous conflicts had been correct. It had other issues, but when you see Western media explain why they trust the numbers, they cite its track record, and they say also, as the Ministry of Health, it has a direct line into hospitals. That's actually true. It has a direct line into hospitals. Sometimes it's a lot more problematic. It also means it's aware of what Hamas is doing in hospitals while denying it. But we see when the IDF troops take those hospitals out of terrorist control, the tunnels and other things, or the video of hostages. Regardless, the point is they have the hospitals, they have data coming in from the hospitals. So to some extent, they are the ones who are going to be receiving the actual reports. And of course, there are many, many casualties that, even in a war waged entirely consistent in a manner with concern for civilians and humanitarian law, it's impossible to avoid the death of civilians. And if the adversary like Hamas is using schools, mosques, UN buildings as military facilities, if it's built 500 miles of tunnel under the Gaza Strip, it's much, much harder. That is essentially, they've turned the Gaza population into a collective human shield. So we're not, by no means am I asserting there are no civilian deaths or anything like that. There are many, and it's terrible. And my fundamental point would be that on a moral level, it's fundamentally on Hamas. Regardless, moving forward, the Ministry of Health, right, it does collect this information, although it also said that in many cases it's lost contact with the hospitals during the war. Because it has this information, it's been able to put out fairly long lists of the names of those who have died. It put out 7,000 initially in October. It put out around 21,000 in the end of March, and more recently 24,000. There are some issues with these lists. Even one British or Harvard-trained economist in the UK who has examined the data and been very much an advocate of the ministry all along, even he says, you know what, there's about 4,000 bad entries, even here, in the ones the ministry claims are correct. And I'll just finish up by pointing to the big example of sort of the ministry's manipulation. Again, they don't exactly trumpet it from the rooftops, but they issue these documents online on an app called Telegram. It's a bit like a version of Twitter or other social media apps. And they started issuing these statistical digests last December. And there's included a note that said, well, we've lost communication with hospitals. And what we've decided to do instead is to estimate or report how many individuals have died based on, quote, reliable media sources. That phrase is a bit of a paradox in the Gaza context. There was no independent media. The Western media doesn't have sufficient access to be reporting on casualties individual by individual. And it wasn't a trivial number. At that point, 1 out of every 5 deaths they reported was based on a media source. And then it rose substantially so that in the first quarter of this year, January, February, March, more than 75% of additional deaths were based on these, quote, reliable media sources. That's why you have this very large number even now of unidentified individuals that are dead. It's not clear they're dead. And one of the biggest points of confusion is many people think when they say there are unidentified individuals that sadly they imagine partial or full corpses that have not been identified. That's not the case. The ministry, I think it's glad to have people infer that, but it never said. It always said this is based on media reporting in direct distinction to cases where the individuals, their remains, went through the hospital system. And that's why, even if it's not as wildly off base as the GMO, the Government Media Office, it's still a very problematic source.
Wasn't there also an idea that there were double and triple counting of the same the same bodies? Was that also an issue within the system?
It was one contributing factor, and it's possible they've improved on that front. So back at in early April, right after they issued the list that had around 21,000 names, our analysis, the analysis of a number of other experts, including the economist I mentioned, who has been a defender, he said, yeah, we have around 450 duplications. It appeared the duplications happened because, as part of their effort to keep the numbers high, they have a system where if a relative of yours is missing or presumed dead, you report it to the ministry. And by itself, that's not a problem. We, of course, should do that for those who are missing or dead. But they didn't seem to deconflict that with the reports they already had. So basically, hundreds of people the ministry had already cataloged as dead were also reported dead by their families. In the latest release of data, that's been reduced by a lot. So it's possible they dealt with that, but it has been an issue.
I feel like everything that you've explained is sort of really just another example of the sort of just add water sort of concentrated algorithm here, which is the media doing the work of reporting on this war versus anything that any third party, any reliable statistic, any reliable institution. This really sort of just says it all, taking the numbers from the media office versus any sort of health official. That's just my impression from here.
Yeah, if the media showed the same skepticism toward information coming from Hamas or Hamas-controlled or pro-Hamas sources as it did, say, to virtually everything coming out of the Israeli government or the American government. And I got to say, I like when the media shows skepticism of things coming out of government. I've worked in government. Government makes big mistakes a lot of the time and needs someone to hold it to account. But you got to spread that skepticism around. And it was really sort of amazing. I mean, the initial response, especially, your listeners may recall that back in October, I think specifically the night of the 16th, there was a massive blast at Al-Ali Hospital, a hospital in the northern Gaza Strip. The Ministry of Health, the supposedly more credible Gaza institution, rushed within an hour to tell reporters this was an Israeli airstrike, 500 people are dead. How did they know within an hour that 500 were dead? Never clear. But the media rushed to put that in the headlines. It would be like Israeli airstrike causes hospital blast, Palestinians say. So in the most direct sense, it was not literally untrue. But when like the world's leading newspapers put a story in a banner headline at the top of their website, what it means is they basically believe it's credible. And then, like every few hours, they had to revise it. After that, it was, blast kills 500 at hospital, and then it was blast kills civilians at hospital. As the entire story melted away, by the next morning, there was, what people saw once it was light. There was a small crater, not consistent with a bomb Israel would use. There was signs of burning, consistent with a rocket fuel you'd see in a Palestinian rocket, and subsequent investigations have borne out this was a case where a rocket from Palestinian fighters killed Palestinian civilians, and they rushed to blame it, of course, on Israel. And the media bought that, and the New York Times even later issued sort of a post-mortem saying, we were a little too credible with regard to Hamas sources. And then they went right back to being credible.
But that's been the MO throughout all of this. It's rushed to publish every inflammatory headline that you possibly can and issue a very weak, watered down, by the way, redaction, if at all. And to this day, I hear people talk about the Ahli hospital, and I believe that you wrote as well, 12% of rockets have fallen back inside of Gaza, at least in the first couple months that Hamas shot. What did you write? Something like 1,000 misfires? Is that even
right.
an accurate?
I'm conveying information from the Israeli military here. And so, they tracked this and they posted. I mean, there was the overwhelming majority of rockets fired were in the first couple months of the war. There's obviously still rockets, but the number much diminished. And so I can't remember exactly the date that it was posted, if it was November or December, but they said, look, there's been 11,000 launches. We estimate 12% of them never made it out of Gaza, blew up on the launch pad, fell back on something within the area. And of course, 12% of 12% of 9,500 is around 1,100. You better double check my arithmetic when I'm doing it without a calculator, but I'm sure your listeners can. But the bottom line there is, right, we don't even know how many of the individuals included in the death toll for Gaza were killed by those rockets, right? As we know from the Ali Hospital incident, where we never got an accurate toll, because I mean, the site was cleansed of evidence. There were some intelligence sources saying, oh, it might have only been 50. Others, U.S. intelligence apparently leaked to the Washington Post, it was 100 to 300. But basically, in a single incident, a Palestinian rocket killed a very large number of Palestinians. And there was another 1,000 of those launches that didn't make it out of Gaza. I could only guess. There's no way to really tell you, what happened at scale. But the point is, if you look at this list, even if the quote unquote better list from the Ministry of Health, it includes all sorts of problematic things, but again, not as wild as the GMO numbers the UN was using until May 8th.
Right. I mean, and again, it can't be said enough. People are still to this very day being notified of people who they thought were kidnapped and were found only now dead, killed, murdered on October 7th. This is the painful and extremely difficult forensics process of identifying bodies. So the fact that you have them within 3 to 4 minutes versus here we are 7 months later, it really just, and what you describe and the way you describe it, David, is sort of this the reality of breaking down the bits and pieces and of this war and of what's really happening. And you can't get to any coherence on what is going on here if you don't recognize at least both sides, or at least a more measured scientific take on it, right? We're supposed to love science, that it takes time. And I will say, and it must be said, that we're talking about human beings. These are numbers, and it's outrageous theater and a mockery of genuine suffering that's happening. And these are real humans who have lost their lives. And it goes to the point that I have said before, that my understanding of Hamas is they truly do want 100,000 of their own civilians dead, because their mission is to destroy the hope of peace for another 100 years. And if nothing else, it is also why the mission is also of the IDF to prevent every single civilian death that it can. I'm not making sainthood out of anyone, but that is reality. If you realize that the civilian population is the battleground itself.
Yeah, why don't I just add a bit on, the political implications of all this? Because you could say, I mean, some people, the response, even people who are uncomfortable with criticism of the numbers, is, why are you so obsessed? I even got one Twitter person, they said, you're like Eichmann telling Hitler, maybe it was only 3 million we killed. Like, they really try to trivialize this effort. And so on the one hand, we need the accuracy, but why? It's not just a debating point. These numbers feed directly into U.S. foreign policy. It's secret to no one. The tension between Washington and Jerusalem is at a high point. And these numbers are a key part of it. In his State of the Union address, Biden cited the Hamas-controlled sources, saying 30,000 have died. He actually just said 30,000 have died. He didn't say who estimated that. So pretty wild. In the recent report that everyone was waiting for, called the NSM-20 report, which is going to assess how Israel used American weapons, it actually includes a line saying, we believe the overall death toll from these sources are correct, even though they're controlled by Hamas, because international organizations deem them credible. So you sort of see this process where we say, oh, it's Hamas, but the UN agrees, so the US government can agree. And frankly, it's not clear they had any other evidence beyond the UN agreeing. So, you would consider, and I would say, if the whole idea is that the cumulative amount of these deaths showed to some people in the US government, oh, Israel's not doing what it should to protect civilians, we have to start thinking about holding back weapons, public criticism, instead of siding firmly with one of our oldest partners. That's why these numbers are so important. I mean, and that's also why, in addition to writing about this, I'm reaching out to the State Department, to the White House, trying to get them to pay attention. I don't know yet to what degree that it's an honest mistake versus a politically motivated one. It can often be quite hard to get answers out of those institutions, which are busy by nature. But the point is, I do think if it became accepted that there was this kind of exaggeration and manipulation going on, there would be serious grounds for a major reversal of U.S. policy on this issue.
That's the danger of this. It is people start to use these numbers and they don't even qualify it as Hamas controlled statistics, and then it becomes, an argument to make real sanctions against Israel. I think that I want to ask you, have you seen any other examples in the past of the UN scraping up numbers verbatim like this without doing any sort of third-party checking?
So not firsthand. What I can convey is a very interesting set of studies I read by a woman who worked for one of the UN agencies, the World Food Program, and later worked with a organization called the Sana'a Center, named for the capital of Yemen. And she wrote about her experiences. And so her core message was that the UN constantly exaggerated the extent of the famine in Yemen, that there was real concerns about food shortages. But over time, even as the evidence came in that the problem was abating, UN leaders continued to say that Yemen was on the brink of famine or was already in a famine, because that was an incredibly effective fundraising tool, right? Even if in terrible cases, you can find a picture of, say, a child suffering, and there's a particular picture of a suffering Yemeni child that was, held up in Congress, and we don't want to diminish what that child went through. But when you hold it up and then say this is a systemic nationwide problem, even when evidence points in a different direction, that's an issue. So again, this is not something I've done firsthand. I'm relaying it because I read her series of studies. I found it credible. And she's someone who obviously was inside the UN and saw it firsthand. She's not an outsider claiming this.
What else can we do, David, to get the word out? Certainly, we're doing our part here. Just keep on repeating. What are sort of bite-sized ways we can bring some truth to the dialogue here?
I guess what I'd like to see is more from the Israeli government. I think they get the general point that this is part of the Hamas strategy. Or, for example, with the Ali hospital blast, within a few hours, they were out with their own released intelligence sources, casting doubt on it. But I haven't really seen any indication that they are closely following exactly how Hamas manipulates the numbers. It was actually on a different podcast just a few days ago that the prime minister, for the first time, gave his estimate of how many civilians have been killed. It's with no real indication of how they arrived at that estimate. Now, you could say, of course, they used intelligence and other sources, but in the game of public opinion, you have to offer some kind of explanation. Otherwise, there's not a lot of reason. Certainly, reporters are not going to treat anything Netanyahu says as credible without proof. He knows what kind of relationship he has with the media, so he shouldn't expect much deference on that point. Even in the past, there's been statements from military spokespersons saying, we think the overall number from Hamas may be about right, and we differ on the gender of those who've been killed. So, I'm working to reach out to everyone I know, with access, on both sides of the ocean, of the Mediterranean, and say, look, I can brief them on the whole backstory. And I do know for a fact some of my writing has been circulated among senior officers, but there's still a lot to do.
There's so much to do. And actually, I was very encouraged. I saw an interview with Colonel Jonathan Conricus, who I believe is a colleague of yours, who
Absolutely.
also speaks so clearly and brings so much coherence to this issue. And I saw him addressing, which I hadn't heard anyone really take seriously, which is something I sort of yell into my computer screen on a regular basis, which is exactly a department to speak these truths. This isn't about Hezbollah. This isn't about taking a perspective or manipulating it. There are objective truths. There is still a shared reality, and we need to offer it because the din is winning out. So you can let him know I sign up.
A little positive note maybe for us to conclude on is that one sign of just the incredible sort of feeling this issue arouses, and when I write about it, I'm not like a big social media guy, but I did a thread on Twitter, and it got 1.4 million views. Like, that's shocking for someone who has as few followers as I do. And what it included was Israeli ambassadors retweeting it and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they got up and noticed a little, something's going on. I think it's the UN admission grabbed attention, but hopefully, maybe that can be an optimistic note to end on, that the Israeli establishment is starting to realize what they need to do.
Well, I appreciate that, and more to the point is that we understand that we are living in a time that isn't. There's not. We're not waiting for someone else to come and solve our problems for us. This has got to be sort of a bottom up, and that's really an initiative that I think that so many people are sitting at home watching truth be beaten and bullied. And so I actually do think there is a lot of hope that people are going to start, that there's going to be more of this speaking truth to power coming out of this. So we're starting it here. Thank you so much, Dr. David Adesnik, finding your work on the FDD. There's also, I'm going to add some of these articles from Fox News and the other ones and your lengthy threads that you gave us on X. And thank you. And we'll see you again.
Thank you for having me back. And
Thank you.
best of luck.
Thank you.